Hi, this is Poppy and Geoff Spencer, your relational experts, speakers, and authors. We had a blast last week with our friend, colleague, and fellow expert, Jody Aman, author of U1 Anxiety Zero. And Jody shared with us some profound insights. With social media content being more and more politicized these days, people are becoming more and more anxious, upset, and fired up. And you know what? We wanted to talk a little bit about it because it was Oscar week this past Sunday. And how about those Oscars on Sunday night? We'll touch on some of the events that took place there during this segment. And this is our last of Your Healthy Heart series. Geoff and I always do debriefs on big events and, of course, movies as they relate to what we do as relationship experts. So Sunday night's Academy Awards was no exception. And I personally love watching the red carpet.
I don't.
But he's a good sport. He tags along. I always think the red carpet's a wonderful way to escape into make-believe, being transported back in time to like childhood innocence, where as children we played dress up. For women, it can be.
I didn't play dress up.
For women, it might be a more positive experience. And some of those dresses were like, wow, they were pretty amazing. And so while many leaders in the world desire transparency in our collective interactions, maybe even view it as empowerment, we noted that many of the dresses offered us literal transparency.
Yeah, there were some very good parts to that. You're right, I forgot.
Perhaps it underscored what we desire in our socio-political lives, that transparency or empowerment.
Okay, let's talk about the winners and losers. And after seeing both Arrival and Manchester by the Sea, we did some homework before we watched the Oscars. We saw a couple of them that were available on iTunes, so we watched. Well, after watching those, we might have selected another actor. We thought maybe Denzel Washington, who offered a broad spectrum of human emotions and fences. While Casey Affleck portrayed a compelling character whose tragedy and despair, gosh, it hung on him like a soaking wet wool blanket, his role appeared somewhat one-dimensional to both of us. Kind of very just detached and so depressed. So depressed. As relational experts, we would have used our diagnostic trademark communication tool, the emotional clock, that includes forgiveness, a very important part of healing. We support redemption and forgiveness as essential elements to healthy living. Affleck's portrayal of a broken spirit was consistent, and like a gas gauge stuck on empty, his character performance meter never varied from that one setting. While we thought Denzel's performance in the trailer that we watched was very powerful, the dynamic with his son and his wife, as human beings, we emote many feelings. And so if we were If we were the Academy who got a vote, we'd go with Denzel, who evoked a broad range of emotions.
And how about the big goof? I have to say, we went to bed, but I woke up really early and I checked it out. We looked at the big goof on TV and we recognized immediately how awesome it was, the grace and poise with which La La Land producers managed that mix-up. They sort of reach for the next best feeling or thought. And we advise our clients to do the same thing. That's always a preferred response. Geoff and I believe the real Oscar goes to Jimmy Kimmel, who fell on his sword, sort of took the fall for an event with which he had no culpability. In a culture that's quick to point fingers, we found it refreshing that Kimmel took blame out of the equation so people could move on to more productive behavior. Sort of like next envelope, please. And while we're at it, I know that I personally love all the glam with the red carpet. My spouse enjoys movies like Arrival, where his mind is instantly engaged. And we won't give any spoilers, but we were immediately just captivated, transfixed by Amy Adams' role as Louise Banks, who in the movie Arrival held a doctorate in linguistics.
Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, he was a scientist in this, and they encounter extraterrestrials, but Amy as Louise was brought in to try to decode their language as a linguist. They were struggling with how to communicate. These extraterrestrials were also called heptapods, very weird-looking creatures. Louise discovers that they have a written language of complicated circular symbols that they're trying to communicate with her in these symbols, and she begins to learn and understand these symbols and correspond to their basic vocabulary. And as she becomes more and more proficient, she starts to see and dream vivid images of herself with her daughter and of their relationship with the father. And then when Louise asks what the aliens want, they answer in a strange way. They say, offer weapon. And a similar translation of use weapon is made by other countries at other sites. And there's a huge fear of a potential threat from these aliens that leads other nations to shut down communication on these projects and no longer share information. And some people prepare for an attack. They're like I think it was the Chinese. They were ready to dive right in and attack. However, Louise argues that the symbol interpreted as a weapon might have a completely alternative translation, such as tool or technology. I thought it was so cool that language was and also they made it a function of time.
Yeah,
it was
that
completely
was
different dynamic. That language could overcome barriers of time and empowering Louise, in this case, the Amy's character. She could see into the future, and that was a critical aspect of what the aliens wanted her to do.
And you know what? We can sort of do the same thing. We can determine our future. What do? We set goals. We discipline ourselves. We create vision boards. We can do meditation. We can be present and open to all the possibilities around us, especially in our interactions. When we don't say no, when we allow all those possibilities to exist, we too can see the future. This was one element of the movie Arrival that really resonated with us.
That makes me think, Poppy, of our relationships when you and I got back together again. After being apart for 32 years, both of us had plenty of baggage. There was no shortage of that. With our own lives, families, health challenges with parents, the obvious just distance. We lived in separate states, and if Poppy's children had any doubts about me, thank goodness I passed that test. Or like I was with my son, we wouldn't be together. The thing that blew my mind was that I had made huge assumptions. I had been completely and totally wrong for 32 years about why we broke up. I didn't understand it at all. It was just a light misunderstanding in communication. But back then, I didn't have the patience and the maturity to listen and really understand. We could have written a completely different future back then. But we did today. 6.5 years ago, this time, and back together, we were wide open to the possibilities. We didn't say that will never work. We were completely open, vulnerable. We took off the masks, the pretenses. We completely trusted our instincts. We wanted to understand and learn how to communicate as perfectly as we could because we had so much to make up for.
Yeah. And that, I think we all do this to some extent. We look at movies or we read a really good book and we relate it to our references in our lives and how that makes us feel. Two other things about Arrival captivated us. One was the assumption that if we do not understand someone or something, we immediately default into fear and perceive it as a threat. And I think this is so common with us. And the second thing is that we have the patience to seek understanding before drawing conclusions. In all of our primary communications, and we often even speak the same language, guys, why don't we listen well enough? We don't have all the information. We get impatient to seek understanding. And as a Myers-Briggs certified expert, we need to have all the information to reach that understanding and connection. If we know someone is emotionally and intellectually wired differently than us, or if their love languages, Gary Chapman wrote the 5 love languages. If one of our love languages is gift giving and the others is physical touch, or somebody's is words of affirmation versus acts of service, we have to first understand the core language that our partner speaks. And I think, or our boss or our friend or our sibling or our mother or our father, no matter who it is, it's so important to understand from what their first language is, so to speak.
I'd say also the nonverbals, one of the things that we've often talked about. In fact, that's one of the things that The army guys, when they approach Amy about being an assistance to them as a linguist, they play a recording of this garbled mess that they ask her to try to translate from the aliens, and of course she's completely incapable of doing that. But what she asks for is the opportunity to be in person with them and have a chance to understand many of the other aspects of communication, all the nonverbals, and that's where she does make breakthroughs.
To use all of our senses, not just the sense of sound.
Right. Another of the many brilliant things that portrayed in the movie Arrival that fascinated us, both of us, were Amy Adams, Louise's first encounter with the aliens. Well, most of the world perceived the aliens as a threat. The story offered us some great metaphors for vulnerability. Even when afraid, which she was terrified. She literally dropped her mask to get closer to the beings. She was wearing like a protective suit. She was totally vulnerable. In fact, all of her associates were saying that she was in great danger, which she was not. That's one of the first things Poppy and I do with our clients, get them to try to feel safe enough so they can drop masks and embrace the concept of vulnerability and open up and share.
And just as an aside, about 8 years ago, I corresponded with Brené Brown before she even wrote her book, The Power of Vulnerability. In a blog post, I had written about the importance of being vulnerable before the world had even known who Brené Brown was. And the concept came out of my 1999 thesis, where my graduate professor softly told us one day to, quote, embrace the chaos. And I was thinking, like, what is she talking about? Is she crazy? And after, at the time, it seemed like a pretty ridiculous idea. Embrace fear, huh? But over the next few months, I grew to understand both the simple and profound value of what she had said. And that's what Amy Adams does in this movie. No different than Dorothy approaching the great and powerful Oz, still shaking in her red shoes. It's the same kind of thing. So to put this into context for what we do in our conversations and interactions with our loved ones, we need to embrace the fear that prevents us from dealing with the more challenging aspects of our communication. So, all right, sweetie Geoff, how can we segue to our theme today of stop, drop, and roll? In the common reference, stop, drop, and roll is used in the context of a critical moment where there's fire. So is it fire in our interactions, in our communications?
Yeah. Well, we'll offer you some tips on how you can do this. Stop, drop, and roll to put out the fire. Let's start with social media, for example. There's a lot of fires there right now. We see on social media posts like this, and this always blows us away. Anyone who opposes what I believe is not my friend. That's been a regular theme. That if you're not on board with my beliefs, then we can't be friends anymore. And this, what this says is, I don't value you enough as a person to listen, to understand, or respect your opinion. Tragic thing. Sad state of affairs that friendships have been severed because of difference in political views, and so much of this has happened. Many have abandoned social media and Facebook because of the barrage of strong positions, a continual negativity. And we all know this, right? Our master coaches, Steve Harrison and Jack Canfield, they both underscored this all the time. When you are around toxic people, try to limit your exposure to them. It's often, we can't always choose who we're by and who we have to be by, but as much as you can, try to keep around positive people. So how do we do this on social media? We block, we unfollow, we sometimes totally leave the platform. We limit our time spent there.
Right. And if you feel awkward about blocking or unfollowing somebody, I like that, limiting your time there. We used to do that when I was first on Facebook. I was just kind of figuring that out like 8, 9, 10 years ago, whenever it was. And so I would set a timer and I would say, okay, I'm going to be on for 15 minutes and then I'm off. And no matter what, I would just log off.
Especially when you're first getting on, you're trying to find friends and it just goes on and on and on.
Right. So, this reminds me, if our country today were a baby, we might reach out to the biblical figure of King Solomon, who tells us the story of the two mothers who came to them. Each had a baby and one of the babies had died. So, and each went to the king claiming that the remaining child, the boy, was her own. And so the king called for a sword and he declared his judgment. The baby would be cut in two. each woman to receive half of the baby. Well, one mother thought the ruling fair, but the other one begged Solomon, give the baby to her, just don't kill him. The king declared that the second woman, the true mother, as a mother, would never give up her baby if it was necessary to save its life. Well, what if the USA were a baby right now? What would we or could we do?
Well, we could repeat history, Poppy. We could go back to the Civil World mindset, While we are not geographically cut in half, we are definitely cut in half and splintered politically. Here's what we suggest as relational experts in today's podcast theme of stop, drop, and roll. First of all, stop. It means to stop giving attention to the negativity. If you don't know what that is, take a moment to check in with your gut. If you find yourself feeling some of the discouraged emotions on the right-hand side of our trademark communication tool, the emotional clock, that is confusion or anxiety, despair, shame and guilt, and anger, stop what you're doing. That means heart-healthy communicating. If you are face-to-face, redirect the subject to a neutral, emoting subject. It's a virtual communication. Close the social media page. It means stop and redirect your attention to something positive.
I like that. And so the second one is drop. As followers of the concept of law of attraction, we attract the experience and events to which we give our attention. So if we're always looking at negativity and harsh things, we're going to attract more of that into our lives. Esther Hicks, one of my favorite longtime disciples of law of attraction, has written many books and given countless speaking seminars on the subject. She describes the law of attraction like a boat that is in a stream. So when we paddle upstream, we push against, we resist the very thing we don't desire. So she always says, drop the oars. That's a common theme in her messaging, and one with which we agree. When we drop the oars in any of our interaction, it means we don't engage in something that is unhealthy for all parties.
And I love that analogy. Can't you almost feel that the hard work of paddling upstream, and you just let go and the boat just kind of gently turns around, finds its way downstream and flows smoothly and easily with absolutely no effort. It's just a great image, isn't it?
Right. Something else, in other words, something else will take its place if you just drop the oars, something more positive and desirable.
And there's so many different metaphors for that idea of just holding on so tightly to something. If you just release your grip a little bit, you can accept so many other things. And that brings us to the third part of this week's little theme, roll. In Esther Hicks' law of attraction terminology, this means head downstream, or as we just said, kind of go with the flow. This doesn't mean that you, drop the oars, that you agree with or totally agree with someone else or their point of view. It's merely acceptance of the other person. And control has no place when we roll. When we try to force something to happen or force our viewpoints onto others, it's completely upstream behavior. So in our conversations that are face-to-face, we let undesirable comments go in one ear and out the other. We don't need to retort or engage or argue or even respond. And if you do feel the need to respond to something to which you are adamantly opposed to, you can always say something like, well, that's an interesting perspective, or, yeah, I can see why you might say that, and nod your head, which acknowledges and validates the other person's response. Now, if this is a virtual communication, you can keep scrolling or rolling. We talked with clients the other day and who asked how they could deal with the divisiveness in the country, and we suggested that they say, yes, there is a lot of division, and we hope people can find some common ground. Neutral statements are rolling and letting go.
I like that. So King Solomon was kind of a roller, meaning he went with the flow of the request before him. He proposed a drastic solution, believing that the innate goodness of the biological mother would reveal itself. And he sort of believed in the faith of humanity. Just because people are feeling unsettled and lost, confused, angry, some of them in despair, does not mean that we as a collective humanity are lost forever. We have so much control in our own lives to go downstream or go with positive thoughts. But we choose all of our thoughts and feelings, and choose being the operative word. One of the reasons we find many people choosing negative emotions is that this is something that I think we touched on a little bit last week with Jody Amon, our guest, is that we are evolutionarily wired that way. You know, that fear is one of the most resonant emotions in our beings. And as a psychology professor, I used to teach that to my students, that the human brain has a 4-to-1 ratio of negative emotions to positive ones. It's like, wow, 4-to-1. That means that we have to do a ton of dropping oars and going downstream or going with the flow 4 times to every negative experience with which we interface. That's like amazing.
It is. So what we do is to stop and ask yourself this one simple question. Does what I'm thinking, feeling, or doing feel good? And yes, even in anger, in fire, we can feel good. But alas, it's a temporary feel good. You know, you can get that little moment of empowerment from anger, but it quickly goes away. After a long-term progression of anger or aggression, it's not heart healthy either, and that can be shown many different times in studies that'll definitely affect your cardiovascular health. It disrupts our communities. It disrupts our relationships. Disrupts our well-being. Part of the grief and loss process includes anger. And the cure for that is acceptance, or dropping the oars, going with the flow.
Yeah, that's good. So for many years, we've asked many of our clients, do you want to be right or do you want to feel good? And some will be really funny and say, I want to do both. Some will say, I feel good when I'm right. But we cannot really have it both ways. You know, right or justification has no place in heart-healthy relationships. Righteousness is like fast food. It tastes good but after a bit, your body doesn't feel very good. So like Geoff said, if we can pause and do a gut check to see how we feel in our body toward any experience we encounter, we will quickly learn how we need to respond. And it's almost always dropping the oars, feeling good, which is what the biological mother did in the King Solomon tale. You know, if we can pause for 1 or 2 seconds before we respond and not react, by the way, it'll give you peace of mind in your heart and carry you through to heart-healthy communication. You know, it's kind of what Jimmy Kimmel reached for the next best feeling Sunday night when he accepted culpability for the mistake at the Oscars. You know, he didn't have anything to do with that. Reaching for the next best feeling, you know, for the collective whole, everybody that was gathered there, and for all the viewers worldwide, diminished the sting or the punches in the events that attempt to rock our world.
And it was really a brilliant move on his part.
Yeah,
I mean, he took this train wreck that was taking place on stage and the embarrassment, the frustration, I'm sure anger by many people, and just quickly tried to, as much as he could, take it on and move the show forward and get beyond that very quickly because it was essentially over. But he had to try to get out of this mess, and he did it very, as well as anybody possibly could.
Right.
Let's go back for a minute to the idea of how human beings manage the fires that face them. Their grief, for instance, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says we have 5 stages of grief, and when we cycle through them, and there's no particular order you have to do this, by the way. Often you return or stay in one stage longer than the other. But the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Today, our face-to-face and virtual social interactions pretty much land in the denial, anger, bargaining, and depression. At first glance, the 5th stage of acceptance is fairly empty. If we compared Kubler-Ross's stages of grief with Esther Hicks's law of attraction, the only common stream of thought here is acceptance.
I like that. It's like 1. So how can we get there? What does dropping the oars look like in our daily interactions?
Well, I always use leaving. I love Star Wars
metaphors. I knew this was happening.
It's like Luke Skywalker. Remember this great scene and where he's facing the Emperor and the Return of the Jedi, and he's being coaxed by the Emperor to kill Darth Vader. And the Emperor is just delighted to watch this anger flowing on him. He wants to bring out this dark side in Luke, and he's so excited to see Luke just filled with anger. And, and we all know that, yes, there is power in anger, but Luke doesn't give in. He sees the Emperor's delight and Luke is that
he's almost there.
Almost there. He's like the dark side's beckoning to him. He was ready to give in, and then he stops. He just wastes. He stops and he says he hears the voice of Obi-Wan saying, "Don't give in to the dark side." He turns off that lightsaber and puts it down, saying, "No, I'm not giving into the dark side." And as risky as that was, because he is very exposed at this time.
Yes.
When he puts down that saber, and he's exposed to any other attacks. But it's something he knows he can't give into the dark side. That's the worst thing to possibly do.
And I'm sure we've all found ourselves in that situation where we're in a fiery interaction. Maybe words are very heated, energy is very high, it's charged energy. And it's really hard to back out of that, to sort of stop, drop, and roll out of that.
Especially if you think you're right.
Especially if you think you're right. So basically, going back to your example, Luke says what we say: reach for the next best feeling or thought. It didn't feel good for him to give into the dark side. And we would say that to all of us. It never feels good to go with anger or fire. There's usually an accompanying feeling of remorse that follows quickly after that. And yes, anger has movement. I mean, it does have action, but it needs to be accompanied by a targeted goal with a purposeful result for the good of all humanity,
Yep. So to summarize today in the last segment of Your Healthy Heart series with our stop, drop, and roll metaphor, the number one thing to do when you feel the presence of fire in your interaction with someone, figuratively speaking, of course, is to stop reacting. Pause. Don't engage for just a moment. Take a breath.
Yeah. And secondly, we need to drop out of the conflict, the negative interchange, because it doesn't feel good to be in the fire. This is not to say that you slink away in a disempowered state, but rather by stopping, you've already recognized that pausing, that another healthy approach may present itself.
Right. The third thing is to roll again. Take the pathway to a healthy heart by going along with the flow of good feelings, of healthy, positive thoughts and behaviors.
And you may just, win an Oscar for a performance where you have the presence of mind and heart to have paused to figure out a different, healthier way to communicate. Well, thank you all. We appreciate you tuning in to today's podcast. Next week, we begin our third series for the month of March, titled Spring Forward. Yep, it's that time again where daylight savings comes around in March. And we'll probably use our diagnostic tool, the emotional clock, to give you more in-depth strategies for how to do that. And after that, we'll have all sorts of incredible insights that we'll share with you after our 2-day intensive coaching session with our master coach, Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul, amazing guy. We are heading to California to spend 2 days with Jack at his home in Santa Barbara, where our other 12 or so colleagues in our mastermind group will pool all of our collective insights so that we can share them back here with you.
We're so excited about that, and we look forward to doing it, and we would so appreciate it if you would leave a comment or feedback for us on our website. Again, it's relationalexperts.com. Weigh in on what we've been talking about. This is all being done for your sake. We want people to get back to us with, is it ringing true? Are you getting good things out of it? And things you might want us to talk about. Please share with us how you have used stop, drop, and roll communication to step up to be your best self.
Yeah, we love that. Any questions that you have, thanks for joining us. Have an awesome week. Bye.
See ya.